Right, I think in this jumble of wires here, I'm all ready to go. So good morning everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Bylent Sieber. I'm the application specialist and SDR evangelist, software-defined radio evangelist at Edis Research. And today I'd like to tell you about a couple of experiments and projects that I've been working on over this sort of last year or so. And can I just get a survey of the audience? Who's actually heard of software-defined radio before? Oh, quite a few people, yeah? And how many of you actually have a software-defined radio, maybe an RTL dongle or a USRP or something like that? All right. And how many of you know about GNU Radio? Oh, great, all right. Well, that's great news. So you'll see quite a bit of that today. So as an overview, I'd like to talk about spectrum monitoring, drones and first-person video systems for drones, vehicular keyless entry that you might be familiar with cars you've seen around the place, RFID, which is a related topic to that, restaurant pages, and the ISE-E3 reboot mission. Who's heard of this NASA ISE-E3 reboot mission? Well, that's great. So then I can tell you about it. And as I said, most of this is using GNU Radio, which is an open source DSP SDR framework that's really fantastic. So just before I continue, this is actually a waterfall plot. So this is showing you the energy in a particular band of the radio spectrum. Across the bottom there is frequency, and then from top to bottom on the vertical axis is time. So does anybody have any idea of what we're actually looking at here? Does anybody want to take a guess as to what part of the radio spectrum this is actually looking at? Any guesses? Come on, one person must have an idea. Anyone? Mobile phones, that's right. Who was that? Thank you very much, yes. So right in the middle there you can see some narrowband 2G GSM control channels, and then on the other side you have wider band signals belonging to some of the other networks. And what's interesting here is that this is running so quickly, you see how there are those discontinuities in the narrow strip in the middle. That's actually the frequency correction burst that's being transmitted by the cell phone base station so that the internal crystal in your mobile phone can discipline itself with the base station as the reference. So let's first look at spectrum monitoring. Spectrum monitoring is the idea that you can use a software-defined radio to capture in, pull in part of the radio spectrum and have a look at what sort of activity is actually going on there. So here as an example, this is one of the other pieces of software I really like to use called Boardline. It's really pretty and it allows you to investigate and analyze all sorts of different signals graphically. But the interesting thing today is that technology and interface speeds have come so far that you can pull in a huge amount of bandwidth into your laptop from a software-defined radio. So, for example, I've got this guy here, and you're welcome to come and have a closer look at this afterward. This is the USRP B210. It has a USB 3 connection to the computer, and you can pull in up to 56 megahertz worth of spectrum at once into your computer. So here we're actually looking at 50 megahertz, which is that picture I showed you before of the cell band, and you can see all the activity there. If we actually run this as a video there, you can see on the right-hand side there's control channels, and as they fly past, you see that pure unmodulated tone there, which is that single little line in the break, and that's what the phone listens to discipline its internal clock. So the frequency of your clock in your phone matches that of the base station. Now, speaking of mobile phones and base stations, it just so happens that there might be one set up in this room, and if you wanted to try and actually get on there with your mobile telephone, then get your mobile telephone out and then go to manual carrier selection mode and look for a base station name, a carrier name that comes up with a Chinese flavor. Okay? So once you do that, then hopefully someone will do that now. And there should be some activity here in this window. And these are some of the numbers that apply to the system. So when you log on and it's successful, then you can text back a 4 to 10 digit number to the number 101, from which you should automatically get a text anyway, and register your phone number in the system. And if you want to call me at any time during the presentation, then feel free. My number is 2104. So anybody game enough to test it out? I mean, I can just call myself here. I've got two phones that happen to be on the network. I'm going to dial one from the other one. You see there's some activity there. I'm calling myself. Let's get some speaker action happening. Hello. Hello, testing 1, 2, 3. You can't hear it very well. But there's some activity out there, and you can also send text. So feel free to send me a text. If you want me to talk about a particular point, obviously feel free to ask questions, but if you don't want to stick your hand up, then you can text me as well. So has anybody successfully logged on? Anybody trying to log on? It might be that one. Anyway, feel free to send me a text. But the other, oh, there's some more activity there. Someone's trying something. So the interesting thing is that this entire mobile phone base station is running on an open source 2G GSM implementation called OpenBTS. You can download it, get an SDR, try it out for free, set up your own base station. And what's even cooler is that I showed you that board before that you need to hook up to your PC. This base station is actually running on this guy here, which is an embedded USERP. It actually has a dual-core ARM processor plus an SDR in the whole single one thing. So I could, this cable here is simply so that I can show you the terminal on the computer because it's running Linux and GNU Radio, and it's just being powered off this portable USB battery pack. So this is essentially a mobile base station, completely portable, tiny, like that you guys are all using, and that we're all texting and hopefully talking on. So anyone had any luck logging on? No? I mean, something's happening. Or maybe you guys are too shy. Well, feel free to text me anyway. But let's have a look at the next thing then. So, there are interesting security implications about this as well, because you can spoof legitimate base stations and so on. This is completely configurable. But let's talk about more, innocuous spoofing. Everything nowadays is wireless, right? Including my wireless microphone here. I'm talking into this, it's sending radio waves over there, and it's coming out the PA. Now, yesterday, I may have had a look at the spectrum and may have had a look at the pilot tone that this thing uses. So I'm going to try and turn this thing off, and fingers crossed, let's see what happens. So I've got down here my other laptop hooked up to that B200 ready to go. Who recognizes the dude on the screen? Yep. So let's see what happens. Oh, that's the wrong photograph. Is that it? So it's starting up. How do I turn this off? I've switched it off, but the light's still on. So what you can hear is the FM capture effect at the moment.
Don't tell me you're too never gonna give you up, never gonna let you.
It helps if I turn the power up on the transmitter to override this one. That's the problem with FM, that usually you have the FM capture effect, which means the most powerful transmitter wins. And here, because we're at about the same distance and so on, they're fighting. But you get the idea. I was really tempted to rickroll someone else during their presentation yesterday, but I figured I'd just rickroll myself. So I don't know, maybe throughout the rest of the day, watch out. But anyway, I told you we were looking at 50 megahertz worth of bandwidth. You can also get some other USERPs that can pull in even more, 100 megahertz worth of bandwidth, 200 megahertz. And so this is looking at the entirety of the 400 megahertz band. So imagine that a broadcast FM radio station that you listen to on your normal radio is about 200 kilohertz wide. This thing is 100 megahertz. So you can fit an awful lot of FM radio stations in there, or any other signal for that matter. Now, if you wanted to kick it old school, instead of having all the pretty graphics, you can also do ASCII art FFTs there. So this is looking at about 120 megahertz worth of usable bandwidth. And these are actually all of the FM radio stations clumped in the middle there. But this is cool because if you don't have a monitor, you could SSH in through a terminal and then look at the radio spectrum using ASCII art like that. So just a bit of fun. So when I travel around and I'm doing a bit of spectrum monitoring, it's not hard to see which car I'm actually traveling in. It's the one with all the antennas sticking out from the roof. And so this is when I went on a bit of a road trip in Las Vegas, and in the back there I've got my laptop, a B210 and the X310, which is the big one that captures all the bandwidth. And I created this spectrum monitoring software so that you program in the frequencies that you want to listen to, and it will just step through them and capture some data and plot them for you. And so you can see what sort of activity is happening on that spectrum. And if you look closer at one of these iterations, it tells you the GPS coordinates, the frequency that you're listening in, the gain, and the antenna selected, and so on. And then you get a plot that's showing you the activity there. So there's all sorts of different channels, and that's actually looking at the mobile telephone band again. So if you wanted to program it, it's all written in Python, and then you can just specify in here, these are 4 frequency ranges that it's just going to step through and continually iterate through. And then you can also add plugins to it in Python. This is all open source, it's on GitHub. But this is cool because this is what it looks like as it's stepping through. It just goes through and you can see activity on the band there. Blue is the average, red is the maximum, and green is the minimum for any particular capture. And because it also logs the GPS coordinates, you can put a GPS module in these radios. This was actually the path that I was driving through Las Vegas, and each step is actually spatially tagged. So when you capture some of the spectrum, you can see where it was captured. And then you can add plugins as well. So if you want to do energy detection, say the blue line is the FFT mask, it's the energy mask, and anything that exceeds that will trigger it, and you can see all this red there, and that's saying it's triggered the mask, and then you can see that you've had a hit in the spectrum of a particular bandwidth at a particular energy. So you can use that to detect energy in a band that you know is otherwise going to be quiet and then trigger something else. And then you can do really wide band FFTs as well. So this is step through, and then you can stitch them all together. So this is the cell band, and then this is the ISM band, 2.4 gigahertz. And you can see all the various ISM energy signatures there. So most of the stuff I'm going to show you is using this board that I showed you. It's USB 3. 56 megahertz of bandwidth. It's bus powered, really, which is really cool. So that whole Rickroll setup I had here was just the laptop and the thing plugged in. You don't need external power, and you can go from 70 megahertz to 6 gigahertz, which is a huge frequency range to step through. So let me quickly show you another quick demo. Remember how we've got this base station running. I've got another one of these little guys. This one actually has the case on here. It's just got an antenna sticking out of it. Remember, this is a fully contained Linux computer. So here I've just hooked up the Ethernet so that we can see something on a display. You can also hook up one of those USB display link devices to the USB port, and then you can have a just self-contained computer. But I'm going to leave that there. And I'm going to run a graph server on my laptop here. And I'm going to run the spectrum monitoring code on the device. So I've just got SSH open. I've SSH into the device. So I'm going to start that up. And hopefully it'll load up. And if I've configured everything properly, then it'll listen to the uplink frequency of the base station here. So what's going on here? The curse of the demo. What happened there? No route to host. I know what it is. It's that damn firewall. So while I just turn my firewall off, has anybody been able to log on the base station? Yep. Does anybody want to try to give me a call on the number? It was 2104. Oh, I know what it is. I changed the IP address of this laptop. So let's fix that. So what I'm doing is I'm actually specifying the IP address of the graph server. So I just need to change that to 253. And we can give that another shot. Does anyone want to call me? Please? 2104? Doesn't work? So if you want, you can also try dialing 600. Maybe too many of you have logged on, it's possible. Anyway, we can come back to that. Anyway, let's come back to that. So the next thing I wanted to show you is drones. So who's actually seen a drone in action or flown one themselves? Yep. So they have meetups all around the place, and this particular meetup is in Berkeley, and all these people come along with their drones, and they do drone racing, and it's really quite exciting, and it's the first time that I'd actually seen this sort of thing myself, and I was pretty impressed with it all. And I thought, well, what if you could, combine droning with SDRing? So droning and flying drones can be pretty exciting. Make Magazine came along that same day. These are drones there. They actually do drone racing, so it's pretty intense. The one interesting thing
FPV drone
is
racing is growing in popularity by leaps and bounds, but with more people getting into the hobby, having more racers turn up at your local meet can be a literal growing pain. Interfering with another pilot's frequencies means complete loss of control of the craft, which can easily lead to broken parts.
So the problem is that if you don't coordinate your frequency usage, then all these people are going to trample on each other's frequency, and this is what this video and article was about. So spectrum management is a bit of an issue there, and because they're using analog video downlink, it takes up a huge amount of bandwidth. So I thought it might be interesting to play around with one, so I got one of these. This is a 3D Robotics X8 Plus, and it's sizable because it can actually lift quite a significant payload. And so I was really excited, and I took it out for the first time.
That's what I'm talking about!
And I was really, really excited.
That's what a drone's supposed to do!
So it flies up in the air like that, and you just use a normal joystick to control it. And then you can either land it manually, or you can flick a switch and it will land itself. So right now it's going to go and land itself. It flies 15 meters up in the air and then tracks over to where it originally took off, and then comes down and
back to the launch point,
lands automatically, which is really pretty cool. I mean, the autopilot
waits for 5 seconds,
really neat. So it just hovers there for 5 seconds, and then comes back down to.
And I'll put the throttle into the lowest possible point, so it's going to disarm once it lands. It's coming in for a nice smooth landing,
and then it gently touches down. The other cool thing is that it has live radio telemetry downlink, so you can see where it is on the map, you can have a virtual display there, you can see what altitude it's at and so on, so it's really good for tracking in real time. So I thought it would be cool to take one of these USRPs that you have here, and you're welcome to come up and have a look at the end, and actually strap it to the bottom. And because this is a self-contained computer, you can run software on it and then fly it around in the air. So what I did here was I plugged in one of these little Wi-Fi dongles, and you can run host AP on it. And then that spectrum monitoring code that I just showed you before, I then ran on it, and so hopefully that sort of picture there is familiar to you. And this is actually now running on the E310 and sending the data back down over the Wi-Fi to my laptop on the ground. So this is just there on the ground,
looking at the cell band
doing its thing, scanning through the bands. And what I wanted to see was whether, if you took it airborne and gave it some altitude,
and then send
whether
back
or not
over
you
the
could
Wi-Fi
resolve
link
many more signals.
the information,
higher up, you're going to have line of sight to
the FFT,
transmitters.
and that will be plotted here
so,
locally on this computer. So you can see here's some activity there. And what's interesting is now that here we're on the ground, we probably don't have very good line of sight to various space stations or handsets. But if we get a bit of altitude with the drone, then we should see some things change. So let's have a look.
This was the night before I actually flew over here, so it was all a bit rushed. I just got it done in the end, but you can see it going up in the sky there. And so you can see here already we've got a lot of more activity registered on our spectrum. You can see because we're a bit higher up, a whole bunch of energy signatures immediately pop up. And,
transmitters, in this case, get a little bit more altitude, and as it scans
the next iteration, you can see
there's
there.
much more activity there. So you can't pick up some other signals there.
You immediately get all these spikes, which are various handsets around the place actually transmitting to mobile phone base stations. So there's a really strong one there. And it's neat because you can see that here this was on the ground. This is about your average energy level. It's about minus 80 dBFS. And then you take the same spectrum and it's about 20 dB higher when you get up in the air. Someone's calling me. Hello? You did? Where are you? Someone managed to get through. Hey, down the back there. Hey, thanks a lot. So there you go. Right, so once again, there's this issue of frequency management if you're going to transmit. And as I said, in this case, you're actually dealing with analog video. So what happens, this is a different application using the E310. What happens if you actually stick a webcam on there? Hello? Oh, no. Okay, you hung up. So what happens if you put a webcam on there and connect it to the E310? So the E310's on the bottom, and webcams is just an ordinary webcam plugged in via USB. And here I'm doing a test where I, in GNU Radio and with a bit of Python, take frames from the webcam, modulate them into GSM, or GMSK packets rather, send them over the air, and the video comes out on the receiver computer. So here you can see a waterfall again of those packets being sent out. This is just the test indoors. And this is, in GNU Radio, what the flow graph looks like. So this sort of describes the flow of the data through all these people calling. What's happening here? Hello? Someone's calling. Don't be shy. Where are you? Hey? Hello? Oh, cool. Yeah, all right. There you go. Thanks. I should put on call forwarding because I'm doing a presentation. So what happens here is that this is actually taking in data from a UDP socket, so from the webcam software that's capturing the frames, and then it's sending them out. And in this case, it's modulating with QPSK, so I get double the bandwidth, double the throughput. And then it goes out to this this final block here. Oops, sorry. This final block here, which is representing the SDR hardware itself. So this describes the flow of data and is actually the modem, the modulator, one side of the modem. And then here is the receiver. So this block on the left represents the SDR hardware again, and does a demodulation, finds packets, deframes them, and sends them out a UDP socket to the other Python script that's actually receiving these packets and reassembling the video frames. So it's quite a nice graphical tool to develop the SDR side of things. So got a bit of an outdoor test then, set it up there with my laptop and a B200
and right over
receiver
there
side of it.
3D Robotics,
and then I've got the webcam and the drone there with the, running this software on board. And so, I mean, really the motivating factor about this is that because it's not analog video, it's digital video now, it's not going to be susceptible to interference per se that will manifest itself in a degraded fuzzy picture. Either the video frame will get through or not, but usually the digital modulation schemes, you can use error correction and so on. And then if it works, as you can see there in the top right, you'll have a crystal clear picture. And so it's in the air and it's pointing back at us, and you can see us there.
So there's the drone, and there we are.
More importantly, this is the interesting thing. With analog video, you're just transmitting in one large portion of the spectrum. With digital video, you can actually allocate a specific portion of the spectrum or dynamically hop around and share that spectrum automatically and not have to worry about doing any manual coordination, which is what they have to do in the past. So there are a lot of other frequency hopping schemes like Bluetooth and
so let's,
the actual digital remote control of the drones. It's all hopping, so the radios hop automatically and the receivers know where to look next. GSM as well, and it's all really clever frequency coordination and sharing of the radio spectrum. So you can have lots of these video links running, and you wouldn't have to worry about telling all your friends and neighbors what frequencies you're using. So there it's flying away again. And it's just really cool because these drones can go really high up in the air and you can take some really cool photos of stuff. Like there, it wasn't the intention, but you can, end up looking into people's backyards and stuff. It was a bit weird. But here, this is a screenshot of the screen there. This is the QPSK demodulator. You can see the 4 clusters of dots because it's 2 bits per symbol. That's sending the raw data to the frame parser, and then it's putting it on the display there. And you can see behind it, APM Planner is showing you the map and where the drone is. So it's every single time a frame gets reconstructed, it displays it there on the right-hand side, and then you have the waterfall of the spectrum, which is being sent down, the signal which is being sent down by the E310 on the drone. And then, we sent it up to 25 meters up in the air, and you can see, as I said, quite a way into the distance. On the back of it, I had a GoPro, so the aim is to make the images look like this when they come down. But, this is just a very quick prototype. So that was that. So let's now move on to a slightly different area, which is vehicular keyless entry. A colleague of mine has a Prius, and it always fascinated me that you could just walk up to the car and then open the car and not have to touch your remote control, and the whole thing was open up. So we took out the laptop and a couple of USERPs there, and we were studying how the car is constantly broadcasting on a low frequency a challenge, and then when the remote is nearby, it picks up this LF challenge with a 3-axis LF pickup, and then it replies on the UHF frequency as if you would press the button, but it does all this seamlessly without you knowing, so it replies on UHF. And this is the setup here, so I've got a coil of wire there which is just tucked into the door handle, picking up this LF challenge, and then that antenna which is receiving the UHF response from the remote. And so if you actually capture all this, you can see there that there are these transactions going on, and then in the LF, it does a wake up for the remote, it sends an ID of the car, and then it sends out the challenge. And then there's some crypto that goes on in the remote, and then it sends back the response. So if you were to look at the UHF response from the remote, that's that one. You've got 2AX, and then you've got the response after that crypto computation. Now, the cool thing is that if you use one of these radios that has 2 channels, you can capture all this at the same time using the same clock and see how it all aligns in time. So here, the blue is this periodic pinging from the car, and the red is that response from the remote control. And if you were to look at a video of that, you can see as it runs by, this is the animated waterfall with the 2 channels going, you can see this activity happening. And this is a very simple flow graph. That was board line there, but I have a little block that you can drop in there, and so you have the SDR giving you the 2 channels, and then you drop in the board line block. So when you run this GNU Radio flow graph, it'll run board line and send the data to it, which makes it quite convenient. And so I thought, well, what if you could sort of do almost a man in the middle? What happens if you could separate the air gap between the car and the remote control, and you could have some SDRs on one side, SDRs on the other side, and just ship these packets back and forth. Now, I have to warn you, don't get too excited because it didn't work, but it was more just an experiment to see how you would go about doing it and writing a little bit of interesting software. So this is that wake up again, looking in GNU Radio. This is the challenge that was registered there. So in GNU Radio it all works, and then I've got some software there sitting outside that's listening for the LF from the car and is ready to rebroadcast the UHF response from the remote control, but it's not actually there. So inside, these 2 areas are connected via Wi-Fi. Inside is this X310, and that's going to transmit the LF, retransmit or relay the LF response, the LF interrogation from the car to this coil of wire there. And then I'm going to check that it's coming through with this loopback, so I have another coil that's going to pick it up. And if there were to be something sitting on that coil, then if it's transmitting in UHF, then that B210 will pick that up and then transmit that back outside through the Wi-Fi. So essentially you're going to be listening for energy bursts, packaging them up, shipping them over Wi-Fi, and retransmitting it on the other side. So if I put a remote control on that coil, it's going to think that it's actually next to a Prius. And that little coil is transmitting the same thing that's coming from the car. And if you look there closely on the screen, you can see that wake-up signal is actually being found outside. This is VNC of outside. And then this is a GNU Radio flow graph that's listening for those bursts and then shipping them off over a TCP connection. And then here inside, that same signal is showing up coming out of the USERP inside. So the remote is thinking that it's near the car, and then this is the LF relay inside. I won't go into the details there. It's really quite simple stuff. You're just shipping one thing and replaying it on the other side almost instantaneously. So here we have that LF response, and now the remote control is active, and it thinks that it's at the car, and it's actually transmitting back this UHF response to the car, it thinks, but instead it's actually going into the USERP. And so that's going to pick up the ACK, and then the ACK will be received by this flow graph and then packetized, sent over the Wi-Fi link back outside and retransmitted to the car. And that's outside, and you can see that it's actually transmitting outside as well. And that's the transmitter. So, I was really excited. I didn't look too much into things, and I had a feeling in my head that it wouldn't work for a very specific reason. But I thought, whatever, we'll see what happens. So I put it on there, and you can see there that it's picking up the challenge, it's sending the response. Well, the ACKs. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. And then I ran outside as quickly as I could. Super excited. Wishful thinking, because I said, I'm telling you that didn't work. And then, of course, the car's still locked. And this wasn't a big surprise to me. It was more just a bit of a challenge to set up this relay interface. But who can tell me why? It's pretty obvious why this wouldn't work. And you would hope that it wouldn't work, right? Any ideas? Yes, that's right. So the killer here is the latency. If you look at this is actually now both signals captured together. Blue is LF, red is UHF. Let's look at them in the time domain. You can see here that the turnaround time is incredibly quick. This is the LF wake up. The remote control replies immediately here. And then immediately after that you have the ID and then an ACK and then the challenge and the response. And this thing happens really, really quickly, as you can see there. So even with my Wi-Fi packetization stuff, the latency and overhead that's introduced there in the timing will exceed these thresholds. And luckily they have implemented the security properly so that if you exceed that, then it ignores it. It is possible to use higher bandwidth links, and if you do direct from one radio to another and use some FPGA smarts and so on, you might be able to get down to it. So that's left for future work. So that's keyless entry. Now, related to this topic, RFID, I was driving around and I saw these antennas on these street posts, and I was wondering what they were because they were pointing down into the lane on the road. And so I got my laptop out and captured it with my own Yagi there. And then it turned out to be Fast Track. So this is those modules that you put on your windscreen so that when you go through electronic toll booths, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, and they have different names everywhere, but the toll booth can identify you and then subtract from your account. And so somehow these things contain an account ID, and they're read as you drive through. And this is actually one of the toll booths the toll booth at the Golden Gate Bridge. And I went there with my Yagi and my laptop and was looking very, very, let's say not suspicious, pointing it at the toll booths. But Fast Track is interesting because it uses 900 megahertz ISM. A wake-up signal will wake up your tag, but the tag does not have a radio inside it that will actively transmit back. It uses this thing called backscatter modulation. So it'll be energized, and there's a passive antenna that is inside it, and the load will change on it that's controlled by a little microprocessor. And the radar cross-section of that antenna will change, and the way that it changes will actually be the modulation of your data that's read back by the reader. So it's a really, really clever system, and they have a long life lithium battery in there, and it lasts for years, and you don't have to replace it. Because it's not actively transmitting. It's just changing the way it looks to the transmitter. So if you were to look at the signal, again, it's a similar sort of thing like the keyless entry. All this stuff is linked. There's a lot of really similar stuff in all of these different protocols. So there's a wake up, there's a preamble, there's the payload. In this case, it's saying, hey, tell me your ID. And then because it's backscatter, you need to energize the tag. And so you have this unmodulated backscatter carrier that's transmitted to the tag. And so what you can do is you can use this really cool RF device called a circulator. You transmit in port 1, and then you hook your antenna up to port 2, and all the energy coming around from 1 to 2 will go out of the antenna, but it won't continue around to port 3. And any energy that ends up coming in from the antenna will come out of port 3, but it won't come back around to port 1. So it's this way of isolating these ports. And so that way, you can actually get a USRP, do transmit and receive, have the circulator in there, and use a single antenna to both energize the tag and read it as its radar cross-section changes. And so what you can do then is you can, hopefully the signal is familiar to you, that's the one I just showed you before. That's going to be the interrogation, and then you have this unmodulated carrier. When you put the tag there in front of the antenna, then it will suddenly have this backscatter energy received and then modulated on top of this backscatter carrier. And that's what actually contains, in this case, my Fast Track ID. And so none of this is encrypted, so I could just hold it up and it'll read it. and the GNU radio flow graph will look for the preamble coming back from the tag using a match filter, and then sample the bits and then decode the data. So we've got one there behind the windshield, and I just hold the antenna up to it, and then it reads it just like a call booth. So you can go around and read everyone's tag, and of course there are implications of that. You can spoof people, or stand on a bridge above a highway, or track people, and so on. And this is the flow graph for that one. It's a little bit more complicated, but it comes down to this fast-track decoder block that knows how to decode this particular protocol. And in a similar vein, with backscatter, this is the, of course, I imagine most of you have key fobs at the office to get through doors, security badges. This is the recorded transaction there. And you can see here that, again, it's sort of split up into these stages of wake up and preamble and some sort of challenge response. If you look into this larger bit of data here, then this is using backscatter because, with these RFID tags, they're passive. So the reader will energize it, the microprocessor will start running and do some computation and send back the result. And you can tell what's going on here because with these larger bits of energy on this backscatter carrier, the larger bit of energy is the reader sending out its challenge, and then the small bit that comes back is the backscatter response from your tag. And so you can see how the transaction happens there. So I didn't really pursue this any further. It was just more about seeing how you could apply this to do some reading. And then if you wanted to do your own analysis, you could continue on from there. So that's that sort of stuff. Restaurant pages. Who knows about these restaurant pages? When you go to a restaurant, you make an order and they give you one of these things and it lights up when your order is ready. Right. So again, that's all RF. And everyone assumes that when it goes off, it means your order's ready. We're programmed like that. And the order of collections and ordering should be the same. The rate should be the same, unless everyone might be paged at once. So how do you figure out what frequency these things are operating on? It's either on the device, you can look it up on an online database, or you can actually just scan the spectrum again and find where it actually is in the spectrum. So the step one, once you record it, is looking at the kind of signal it is. So once you find the frequency, this is the pager signal there. And you can tell then that it's frequency shift keying because it's alternating between two different frequencies. And there's a very frequent transition of these frequencies. So every transition is a 1 or a 0. And because there are so many there, it gives you a clue as to how the data is actually encoded. And because there are so many transitions, it's probably using some sort of line encoding like Manchester because it helps the receiver lock on to the signal and recreate the clock. So this is a sort of simple flow graph to do some preliminary analysis. The steps are that you find the broad frequency, you find your signal of interest, and then you shift that down to baseband, so you can use this frequency translating FIR filter. Then, because it's frequency shift keying, you need to figure out the distance between these two frequencies that it's going to be alternating between. So you can do that. That's finding the deviation. And once you know the deviation, you can use this quadrature demod, or it's essentially FM demod. And that will then translate these changes in frequency to, in the time domain, these very obvious transitions between, in this case, 1 and -1, which you can then simply sample and translate to a binary 0 or a binary 1, which is your raw data stream. And then the missing step here is that we don't know how often these bits are being sent. We don't know the baud rate. So you can use a little simple construction, which is at the bottom there. You multiply the signal by a delayed version of itself. It's called cyclostationary analysis. And then you do an FFT of that, and then the first largest peak will actually tell you the baud rate of your signal. It's really quite neat. So once you know that, then you can use a block that will sample the signal at the right time and then give you a 1 or a 0, which is called clock recovery. So once you actually do that and you get your raw data stream, then it will look like this. You have your raw data stream there. There's a little bit of software I wrote ages ago, and it just helps you experiment with all sorts of different combinations of line encoding and character representation and so on to find something in the data until it makes sense. So here this is just the straight up stuff, but because there are so many alternating 1s and 0s, it's probably Manchester encoding. So if you turn Manchester encoding on, then you get half the number of bits, but it looks far more sane now. And you can test if it's Manchester because you either have a transition between a 0 or a 1 or a 1 and a 0. You can't have a 0, 0 or 1, 1. That's illegal. So if you shift everything by 1, then it will tell you that you have all these Manchester violations, and that's a confirmation that, in fact, you were correctly aligned in your Manchester decoding. So once you stick with Manchester, you apply them to 2 different pages, and you can see in green all the bits that are different. So that will give you clues to where the ID or the number of the page is encoded in your packet. So once you do that, then you can pretty quickly see that where various things are encoded, and then once you play around with various CRC algorithms, you can figure out how they do the checksum on the packet. So once you've deconstructed that, then you can create a modulator that does all the same thing, just in reverse order, and then put something together in GNU Radio like this, and then create a modulator. In this case, you just type in the address, and then it will send out the page packet like so, and you can see it happening there. And then you can have some fun. And then you can have an XMRP interface through your web browser on your phone. So I told my colleagues that I was just capturing some more data and went inside, and then I could actually run the pager from my mobile phone via ad hoc Wi-Fi. That's... The number of his pager, went inside. And so the poor lady at the kitchen was really confused because she was trying to find the food and it wasn't there. So the other feature that I have here is this slider, which you can drag as the address from the left to the right side of the screen, and it'll page every single number in the entire address range. I haven't done this, but I won't say that someone else hasn't, and it was pretty funny to watch everyone get off. So another system is POXTAG. It was used as the sort of standard pager protocol with the beepers. There's this GARP POXTAG, which gives you this block. I modified that a little bit, and then a different restaurant, a different pager system uses that. You can deconstruct the packets, similar sort of thing. POXTAG has a particular funny standard that you have to adhere to. I won't go into the details now. But again, you can find where the address is encoded and recreate it. This is another restaurant that uses POXTAG. You can see the page. 46. You can see it going up there. In this case, we had a bunch to play with. And then 46 goes off, and then we'll do 39, and then we'll do 56, and then we'll do 83, and then... So, more fun there. And this is a cool one because with this particular page, you can actually put it, they give it to you when you order. You go and sit down and you put it down on the table. And the table has an RFID tag underneath, and this thing will read the tag and then transmit back to the kitchen where you're sitting so that when they bring the food to you, they know where you're sitting, which is pretty neat. And this is used as Zigbee, and there's this nice out-of-tree module for GNU Radio that will give you a Zigbee transceiver, and this is pretty much the flow graph there. It's quite elegant. And then you can, decode it in real time, and also you can see the packets there in the background, and this is a Zigbee packet, and hook it up to Wireshark. So once you find the right packet in Wireshark, you can see, again, very clearly where the pager numbers are encoded, but you also have to know where the table's encoded because that tells them where you're sitting. I went around the back to the kitchen and kind of leaned over and looked at their display to figure out where we were sitting, and it turned out to be table 36, which is also encoded in those packets. So that's that protocol. So if you want to take a pager hostage, it always listens for this broadcast from the pager system. So if you want to take one hostage, then if that's something you really wanted to do, you would create the broadcast to think that it was still home, because if it leaves the zone, then it gets really angry and goes off. So that's pager systems. Now, this is a bit of a change in pace. 30 years ago, NASA launched this space probe, ISE-3, and it was put into a heliocentric orbit at one stage, and it was originally designed to study the interaction between the solar, wind, and Earth's magnetic field. This is in 1978, International Sun-Earth Explorer 3. And it was renamed later ICE, and it was the first spacecraft to go into the Earth-Sun L1 Lagrange point. And it was also the first spacecraft to pass through the tail of a comet because the US wanted to beat everyone else because everyone else was going out to visit Halley's Comet. And it was put on this sort of mind-bending trajectory originally from the Earth. It went around the Earth, did some slingshots, went out to this L1, and then went through the comet's tail. So if you were to actually visualize that, this is this really cool sort of video showing it. This is actually, so the Earth-Sun rotating frame. So the Earth is there at the center of the circle, and the Sun is out there, and the camera sort of tracks it as the Earth orbits the Sun. So the L1 point is there, it orbited there, did some slingshots, and then it's going to go slingshot past the Moon, boom, pick up some energy, and then go out into this heliocentric orbit. Now, that was a long time ago, and it's an old space probe, and it was spin stabilized, and it talked on the 2 gigahertz band, and it had all sorts of interesting science instruments on board. And then the telemetry would come down from the satellite too, and it would tell you about how the propulsion system was configured and so on when they wanted to make these maneuvers. And so it went on this orbit around the Sun, and eventually they found the transponder signals. As you can see here, this is in more recent times, it's catching up to the Earth, and it was about to actually come back and visit us. And this actually happened late last year. And this is a sort of interesting picture of that trajectory. So what happened was these people picked up the transponder signal because NASA had left it on. And there was no telemetry on it. It was just an unmodulated carrier saying, I'm on and I'm here. And amazingly, after all this time, they still picked up the signal. And so this team got into action and thought, well, what happens if we could actually talk to the satellite again and capture it and bring it back into orbit around the Earth, and then turn the science instruments back on and open it up to public science and STEM education, science and technology, engineering, maths, and that sort of thing. So really cool idea. So they created a crowdfunding campaign to create this reboot mission. And time was of the essence because assuming that the thruster still worked and there was enough fuel on board, there was only a very limited amount of time the window during which you could fire the thrusters to change its trajectory to bring it back into orbit around the Earth, because once it went beyond a particular point, there would not be enough fuel to make the required delta V maneuver. And so how do you talk to a space probe that's, what was it? Well, quite a distance away, 10.5 million kilometers away at this particular point? You go to the largest radio telescope on the planet. This is the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico. It's 1,000 feet across. And so we had a bit of fun there. We took these USERPs there. This is actually the platform that sits above the dish. And you can go up there, and we went up there to install a custom power amplifier and set everything up. And this is back down in the control room. And we just have this laptop and some USERPs hooked up to the patch panel there. And you can see here, very, very weak signal. This is actually the space probe's transponder coming up out of the noise. And then you can see there, due to the Doppler effect as the Earth rotates and so on, this is a single frequency, but because you have all these moving components, you get this Doppler effect, so the frequency will shift. But once you actually point the telescope directly at the thing, because we didn't know exactly where to point, there's still a bit of search involved, you get a really nice strong signal. And then we need to send commands to the space probe to turn the telemetry back on, to actually wake it back up again and assess the state of the spacecraft. So this was the moment where finally we sent out the command, and the spacecraft came alive again and started transmitting all of the data. So it's like Austin, and we were sending commands out. One of our other colleagues was up in the dome, making sure everything was working up in the top there, and so that was our the sort of happy dance. And that was the first sort of big milestone of the mission, talking with this thing. And the interesting thing about this was that NASA threw out all of their old equipment that they used to talk to the satellite. So the equipment wasn't around anymore. And so what other members of the team did is they went digging through all the old NASA archives to find the specifications of how to talk to this particular space probe. And once we had all that information, and there was a lot of conflicting information as well, we recreated these old modems using this open source software and these radios. So we were able to leverage this new reconfigurable technology to recreate the modems of yesteryear, 30 years ago, to talk with this old space probe. So that's why we had all this gear there. We didn't need huge arrays and racks of RF gear like they probably did 30 years ago. It was basically just the laptop down here and one of these boards. So that was pretty cool. So once the telemetry started coming back down, we would listen on the 2 different frequencies, and you can see here, This is the one frequency of telemetry coming back down, and this is the other one. So the spacecraft is sending, what the temperature is, what the angle to the sun is, how the thrusters are configured, and so on. So there was some GNU Radio code, and then this Python script I wrote that would parse the data and then show you exactly what was going on with all the propulsion system and so on. So you can configure the telemetry to run at different rates depending on how far away you are from the Earth. So here it's running at 16 bits per second. And for this, we're actually listening to the telemetry that's being sent from the space probe kilometers away. So that's at 16. And then at 512, and then you could go at a blistering 2K. And so then we tried to fire the thrusters. And there's an accelerometer on board that measures, basically any impulse. And we would hope that when we told the thing to fire and change its trajectory, we would see these spikes every time a thruster valve would open and spray some of the hydrazine out. And unfortunately, we only really saw one big one. And what we saw in the data coming back was that we were getting no thrust. And this was really disappointing, and we tried all sorts of different combinations of tanks because there are two redundant systems and two different sets of thrusters and so on. And unfortunately, what we think happened was there's enough fuel on board because the log suggests as much and other interesting bits of data like temperature deltas over time. But you need nitrogen pressure to push the fuel out. And unfortunately, over the course of the decades, one theory is that the nitrogen might have actually leaked out because, very, very slowly, but essentially there wasn't enough pressure to push the fuel out. So unfortunately, in that respect, we failed, and it did a flyby by the moon, and now it's gone back to orbit the sun again. We turned some science instruments back on, and we got some interesting science data. Unfortunately, the space probe went into safe mode because we had a whole lot of stuff on, and it wasn't getting enough power. The batteries don't work anymore, so it's all just getting the energy from the solar panels. And there was an undervoltage condition, and so the spacecraft rebooted itself. And unfortunately, when the transponders come back up, they come back into receive only. So it's out there somewhere, it's listening, but we don't exactly know where to point to turn it back on again. So it was really a lot of fun, and Google made this cool website, Spacecraft for All, if you want to check out the video they made. It's pretty nice. And they have lots of pretty graphics to show the orbit that it went through, and that's the team. So unfortunately, we couldn't capture it and bring it back, but in terms of the radio side, that was a real success, recreating the old NASA stuff and talking with it again. So that was cool. So just to finish up then, one of my favorite topics is aviation. 747s have a lot of different radios on them, so all sorts of different signals to listen to. Makes someone like me really excited and happy. One of them is ADS-B, and it automatically sends out the position, heading, altitude, vertical rate, flight ID, and so on. And remember how I was talking about Manchester encoding with the restaurant pages? That's the same thing that's used in the data block for these ADS-B Mode S packets, as you can see here. I was saying you can have 0, 1, and 1, 0. Here they're just referred to as late chips and early chips. Different terminology, same concept. And so in GNU Radio, you can create a receiver. This is just listening on the particular frequency and receiving all these packets from all these different aircraft. you can then take them and parse them and take the position out and then plot them on a map. So I wrote this software ages ago, and then this is actually looking at the Bay Area, looking at the aeroplanes that are taking off and landing at all the different airports, Oakland, SFO, San Jose. And then, that's a 2D view. You can then build the flight paths up and color code them in altitude and see what sort of flight patterns you get. And then because you also have altitude, you can do a 3D view in Google Earth. So this is showing a plane taking off from San Francisco Airport. There's one there in the distance coming into Oakland. And because it's fully 3D, I listed this thing in Sydney, where I'm originally from before I moved to the States, and it would show, in Google Earth over the internet, streaming real time, the state of airspace, just decoding. And you can also do this virtual cockpit view because you have all the information, so you can be like the pilot in the plane, pretending to be the thing, and you can imagine what it's like taking off into the sky. So it's that same plane, but from the point of view of the cockpit there. And then, in addition, apart from just getting this plane information, you can also receive on another frequency that essentially text messaging between the aircraft, which is called ACARS, and it sends performance reports, information to the pilots, air traffic control, and all sorts of really interesting stuff, and most of it's in the clear. So what's happening here is that this is Sydney. All of the lines are obviously the flight paths, but all of the little dots are the spatial tags, the points where these messages are transmitted in between the plane and air traffic control, or Rolls-Royce if the engines are sending vibration reports back. And this is all really interesting in the context of various, unfortunately, airline disasters and disappearances, because this is the sort of information they look at. And then that's the active system. So this is when you have equipment on board the aircraft to send this stuff out. But you've also got primary radar. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of a thing at the airports that spin around. These things send out a pulse of energy, and it will reflect off fuselages and other things. So you don't need to have a transponder on an aircraft. You can just look for the echoes as they come back to the receiver. So these radar returns, you send out this pulse, and then you have these echoes that come back. And I took one of these radios up to a hill nearby an Air Force base and recorded, and you actually saw these echoes coming back. So, I'll cut this bit short. Once you synchronize the radar using some software, this is the main bang here on the left, and these are all the echoes that come back after that. The ones that are close in are known as clutter, because they're usually local large objects. But once you actually take all that data and produce this raster plot, you have each scan line, which is basically a bang and then listening for the echoes. And then going down vertically, you have time. So as the radar rotates around, it's going to produce this kind of image, and you have all these interesting things starting to come out, which is this data which I've just recorded with one of these radios. And so once you unwrap that onto a map, this is the Bay Area. You have all this ground clutter here, but you see how we have these interesting shapes. When you do this polar unwrapping, they turn into straight lines. And this turned out to be all these power line pylons that cross the water there, and then echoes from the bridges and so on. So it kind of works. And if you take lots of rotations of the radar and you put them on top of one another, then anything that doesn't move is going to be white. But if you put them into R and the G and the B channels of your color image, anything that moves is going to turn up and as this sort of colored RGB triplet. So in this case, there was some object that was moving as the radar was rotating and I was recording. And then if you unwrap that as well, then there's another one there. And judging from the speed, it might have been a big truck going along a road, and side of it might have been pointing against the radar. It probably had a nice radar cross section that I could pick up. Remember, this is just with one of these whip antennas here. This is nothing special, not like that massive radar dish that has considerable gain. So that's pretty much everything. If you like software-defined radio, I run these free meetups. It's called Cyberspectrum, and we like to have people contribute, and I stream them online. So if you want to join and listen when we do them monthly, it's all free and anyone's welcome. But it's just a cool way of sharing cool projects that people are working on. But yeah, thank you. They're my details, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask us now or come up and ask me up here. Thank you very much.